Hey, how's it going? My name is Wes. Welcome back to another video. In today's lesson, we are going to look at a yellow lesson. And in these yellow verb lessons, normally we learn a new verb, including all of the different conjugations of that verb. Now, today's a bit different. In today's lesson, we are actually going to look at the difference between regular verbs and irregular verbs, which you might have heard me talk about before. So we are going to look at what even are regular or irregular verbs and how do they work in the Spanish language. And I don't expect this lesson to be long, but it's an important one to understand, so make sure you write down your notes. Alright, so today's lesson, regular versus irregular verbs in Spanish. Alright, so before we dive into what regular or irregular verbs are, let's first take a look at the 4 verbs that we have already learned so far. Those 4 verbs were
querer, tener, ser, estar.
querer to want, tener to have, ser to be, as in like a characteristic, and estar, which is also to be, but more when we talk about states. So for these 4 verbs, let's look at the conjugation for the I form. So yo quiero, for example, which is I want. So quiero comes from the verb querer. Or if we want to say I have, so we use the verb tener, which is to have in Spanish, we say yo tengo. Yo tengo. Yo quiero is I want, yo tengo is I have. And then we have 2 different ways of saying I am. Yo soy, which comes from the verb ser, and we also had yo estoy from the verb estar. So those are some examples of different conjugations that we learned from different verbs. Now, as an example, if we look at the verb querer, we saw that the stem or the beginning of the verb, which we call the stem, so it's the first piece, that beginning or that stem as we call it, of the verb, roughly stays the same across all of the different forms of conjugations. So when I say yo, I say quiero, and we add an o at the end. But when I say tú, we keep that first part, that black part that you see, but instead of adding an o, this time we add an es. And then when we say he, she, or you formal, we remove that s and we just leave the e. And for example, when we say nosotros or nosotras, we keep that first bit, that stem, and we add hemos at the end. So depending on who it is that we are talking to or about, we use a different ending of the verb. And you will see the same thing happening with, for example, the verb tener. Again, the beginning roughly stays the same. It doesn't exactly stay the same. For example, with the yo or I form, we say T-E-N-G. But then as soon as we go to tú, so you, we go to T-I-E-N. So it already changes a bit. But still, there is a pattern that we can notice, which is that we basically have a stem. And then after that stem, depending on who it is that we're talking about, the conjugation changes. So the end of the verb changes. So in a way, these 2 verbs, querer and tener, to want and to have, follow the same type of rule, which is that the stem of the verb roughly stays the same. And depending on who it is that we're talking about, the ending of the verb changes. And in the Spanish language, there are rules to how verbs can behave. And if they follow those rules, just like these 2 verbs that we just looked at, which have the same stem but a different ending, then these verbs are considered regular verbs in Spanish. So a regular verb is a verb that follows the rules that are set for verbs. So it has the same stem, but just a different ending depending on who it is that we're talking about. Now, to be honest, when we look at querer and tener, they are not exactly regular, because as we see with the verb querer, if we're talking about yo, tú, él, ella, usted, we use Q, U, I, ER, but then as soon as we go to nosotros, nosotras, we leave that I out of there. And then when we get back to ustedes and ellos, ellas, we add that I again. So it's not exactly regular, and the same with tener, which in the I form has T-N-G, in the U form tú, T-I-E-N, but then for example, vosotros, vosotras has T-E-N. So it's not exactly regular, but the endings of the verb, they are regular. So in this case, actually these are not fully regular verbs. These are actually slightly irregular verbs. But there is actually another verb that we learned, which is the verb ser, to be. And this is what we would call a irregular verb. Now, if we take a look at the verb ser, we actually see something different happening. Because when we say I am, we say yo soy. But then as soon as we change that into you are, we say tú eres. So that soy suddenly changes a whole lot and it turns into eres. So it has nothing to do with soy anymore. And then we see él, ella, usted, es. And then suddenly we go from eres and es back to somos for nosotros, nosotras. So in this particular case, for this verb, there is not a particular stem that is always at the beginning that we add upon to depending on the different conjugations. So the verb in its whole changes a lot depending on who it is that we're talking about. And this is a great example of an irregular verb. And that is actually what this lesson is about. So this is a clear example, a very good example of what an irregular verb looks like. So an irregular verb is pretty much a verb that does not follow the standard rules that are set for verbs. And so that's why we refer to it as irregular. So an irregular verb. And just to have one more example of what an irregular verb looks like, here is the verb ir, which means to go. And so as you can see, the original verb is ir, but as soon as we start conjugating that verb, the ir turns into voy or vas or va, which has nothing to do with the original verb ir anymore. And we also add this y or this y at the end of voy, so V-O-Y. Normally with regular verbs we don't add a y, we just add an o. But if we then actually move on to the other conjugations, you will actually see that it follows pretty much the same rules as regular verbs, which is that it has the same stem. So in this case, the stem is just the V. And then for tú, we add as. For él, ella, usted, we add an a. So we leave out the as at the end. Then for nosotros, nosotras, we add amos, and so forth. So in a way, it follows the same principles or rules as regular verbs do. However, the verb itself, which is the verb ir, actually changes a lot because we go from ir to v-o-y or v-a-s and so forth. And this is actually something that you will see happening very often in the Spanish language, which is that a verb is not completely regular, but also not super irregular. So it's like kind of in the middle of regular, irregular. Now, if we have a situation like that where it's like half irregular, half regular, we still refer to it as an irregular verb. There's not really a term that describes like a half irregular verb. We just call it irregular. But this is actually something important to know because in Spanish, a lot of times you will see verbs that are slightly irregular. So that's just something to keep in mind. Alright, so now you hopefully understand the difference between a regular verb and an irregular verb. Now in this video, I explained that irregular verbs do not follow the same rules as regular verbs, but I did not explain what those rules are. And I did that on purpose because in this video, I don't want to dive into the rules that regular verbs use. I simply just wanted to explain to you the difference between regular and irregular verbs so that when you hear me say this verb is regular or this verb is irregular, you understand what I'm talking about. So in a later lesson, we are actually going to dive a bit deeper into what those rules are exactly. For now, just know that verbs can be categorized into two different categories, either as regular verbs or irregular verbs, and oftentimes you will see that they're kind of in the middle between the two, so they are not exactly regular but also not super irregular. We still refer to them as irregular verbs. So regular verbs or irregular verbs, that's the two categories we have. Alright, and that's already it for this lesson. I hope that this was helpful. I hope that you got something out of this. I hope that I explained it well. If I didn't and you have any questions, please let me know. I'm happy to help you. Also, as always, you can go to my website, SpanishWithWes.com, to get an overview from this lesson or any other lesson in this course. Alright, that's it for this lesson. As always, I hope that you got something out of this. I hope that this was helpful to you, and I would like to see you in the next one. Alright, take care. Adios.